they understood that they may have only had the clothes they were wearing, but they also, at least the men, I should say, the men had the vote. The fact that so many immigrants understood that the franchise was perhaps their most valuable possession. And the way the Irish began to organize their machines is absolutely a carbon copy of what O'Connell did during the Catholic Emancipation movement of the late 1820s.
Welcome to Ireland and the Making of America,
a podcast exploring how Ireland and the Irish have helped shape the United States, politically, culturally, socially, sometimes in ways that people rarely think about.
I'm Liam Kennedy, Director of the Clinton Institute for American Studies at University College Dublin.
And I'm Scott Lucas, journalist, political analyst, and professor of U.S. and international politics at the Clinton Institute.
In this episode, we're joined by Terry Golway, a journalist, historian, and author who's based in New York City. Terry's worked for the New York Observer, the New York Times, Politico, and many other publications. And his books include Machine Made, which is a widely praised history of Irish machine politics, and Frank and Al, a dual biography of Franklin Roosevelt and Al Smith.
Terry will help us explore the Irish political experience in the United States, from their role in urban politics in the 19th century, through national prominence in the mid-20th century, through what looks like a relative decline today. We'll also consider along the way some of the legacies of Irish leadership in the making of modern American political culture.
Hello, and it's great to welcome Terry Golway. Terry, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Well, Terry, we have you here today because you have the ability to talk across Irish politics and everything to do with that at great length and in great detail. We may have to curtail you, but we want to hear what you have to say. And I want to really start with the question, where would you start the story of Irish politics, or Irish American politics, I should say? Where do you begin?
Well, I would begin in the 1820s for two reasons. One, for what was happening in New York and in the United States in general, and then also what was happening in Ireland. Many histories of Tammany Hall, which is the quintessential Irish-American political machine, even though it didn't start that way, but most of the histories of Tammany Hall note that it had been an elite political society, mostly of privileged white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men, until around 1820, or the Jacksonian era, as we say in the United States, when Andrew Jackson, the child of Irish immigrants, was elected president. It was at that point that Irish immigrants in the United States, or in New York, began to demand a role in the politics of New York. And this, of course, was based on universal malehood suffrage, which is what we see developing in the 1820s. On the other side of the Atlantic, we see, of course, Daniel O'Connell's Catholic Emancipation movement. And what I found curious, and I know this is going to sound terribly immodest of me, and I am a modest man with much to be modest about. However, if you were to look at how Daniel O'Connell and his right-hand man, Thomas Weiss, operated in the Catholic Emancipation movement, particularly in the elections of 1826 and 1828, you can see the beginnings of an Irish-American political consciousness, and also the methods that the Irish in America would apply to machine politics in Chicago, Boston, New York, and other places. So,
sorry, Terry, I want to stop you just there because this is one of the things I'm really interested in. I'm sure you're going to get onto it in more detail, but you said the methods. And I'm just wondering, what is it that made the Irish so peculiarly adaptable to the American political system?
Well, the fact that, first of all, let's acknowledge that they had the vote. So they understood that. And once they came to the United States, because Great Britain had allowed, 40 shilling freeholders to vote in the 1820s. They came to the United States with this idea that politics is a collective enterprise.
Right.
Politics is about sending agents into the field, which is what Thomas Weiss did in the Waterford by-election of 1826. He sent people into the field to, organize, to persuade. And that method is what crossed the Atlantic. And when immigrants reached the United States, and particularly in New York, which is my field of expertise, they understood that they may have only had the clothes they were wearing, but they also, at least the men, I should say, the men had the vote. And that was something that traveled the Atlantic as well. The fact that so many immigrants understood that the franchise was perhaps their most valuable possession. And the way the Irish began to organize their machines is absolutely a carbon copy of what O'Connell did during the Catholic Emancipation movement of the late 1820s.
Fantastic. So we have that traveling across, but nonetheless, in the 1820s, we still probably don't have the mass of Irish there quite yet that are going to make a difference, and they're not being well received either.
No, they're not. And that also, I think, leads to part of the Irish American political consciousness, which is that they were outsiders. But the nativism, which you were alluding to, begins in the 1830s and becomes one of the most successful American third political parties. The Nativist Party, the Know Nothing Party, is a direct reaction to famine immigration. And what the famine immigrants saw upon their arrival is sort of the same sort of contempt and the same sort of public policies that were directed against them in the 1820s and the 1830s. For example, in the 1820s, there was a controversy about the Kildare Place Society and the ways in which elites in Ireland were trying to revamp the education system to make it, quote unquote, less sectarian, although people interpreted that to be actually less Catholic, but more Protestant. Upon arrival in the United States in the 1840s, at least in New York, there's the same controversy. How are we going to decatholicize these immigrants? And that takes the form of something called the Public School Society in New York. And it's a Tyrone immigrant named Archbishop John Hughes in New York, who says explicitly, what you saw in Ireland in the 1820s and 1830s is what you're seeing in here in the United States, and we have to act accordingly. So in my telling of the story of machine politics in the United States, the first real political boss of the Irish in America was Bishop John Hughes of New York. And if he were alive today, he would, as the phrase goes, if he were alive today, he'd be spinning in his grave, because he said he was not a politician. The problem is, at least one historian, me, looks at his activities and says, yeah, sorry, Bishop, Your Grace, you were a politician. And you were a good one.
Well, let's think about who really is gaining from this. It's not just the Irish. It's the alliance with the Democratic Party in particular, isn't it? Why do they gravitate to what then the Democratic Party was, and what was the Democratic Party then?
The Democratic Party was a very Jeffersonian organization founded by Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, but also somebody who had a belief in the common man, as long as he was white, I guess. But the characteristics of both Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, there was a time not so long ago when the Democratic Party celebrated its two founders, Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. They don't anymore because both of them were slaveholders, and that's understandable. But Andrew Jackson stood for the universal franchise, universal male franchise. And it was said of Andrew Jackson when he was elected president in 1828 that if he could be elected president, anybody could be elected president. And that was sort of a very top-down look at Jackson. So he was sort of self-consciously a man of the common person. The opposition party at the time were the Whigs. They were more elite. They would sort of be what we in America would have associated with the Republican Party, say, of the 1950s, not today's Republican Party, but the party in the 1950s. Elite business people who believed sort of in a top-down government. Well, once the Irish began emigrating in large numbers at the time of the famine. Well, the Whigs basically say, this is an invasion. We have to do something about this. The Democrat Party, on the other hand, says, wow, these are future voters. Maybe we should work with them, because the Democrats saw the future and embraced it, while the Whigs saw the future and tried to put their hands up to stop the future.
Right. So the Democrats, the Irish, especially here, I think we're really referring to the famine Catholic Irish, began a very strong and powerful association, and especially in the bigger cities. And this takes us to what you've already called machine politics. For those who maybe have heard of it, Terry, but don't know too much, what do you mean by machine politics?
Well, study Fianna Fáil. From my understanding of Irish politics, machine politics, at least is in the American context, is sort of hard to define. Teddy Roosevelt once said that any party should aspire to be a machine. That is to say, get out the vote, win elections, use patronage to your advantage to the extent to which the law allows you to. But what we associate machines in the United States with is a party that, I suppose, brooks no opposition. I think that's an unfair characterization, but it is one that wins elections a lot, which of course is what political parties are designed to do, and that sort of commands a very large base of supporters. And whether that base of supporters is because they believe in the party's ideology or because they owe their jobs to the party, that's a matter of debate. But by machine, I would characterize the machines in the United States as mostly Democratic, although there are some Republican machines as well, still to this day, and a party that is that commands the loyalty of a large number of people.
So in that mid-19th century period now, the Irish are beginning to get elements of political control in certain sectors of American cities. Which particular cities, Terry, and where was the control most pronounced, would you say, in the mid-19th century?
Well, I suppose I have a bias, which I'm trying to put aside, but I would say that New York becomes the sort of capital of Irish American politics, although somebody in Boston would probably disagree with me vociferously. But the fact is, as long as we're talking about machines, Boston never really produced a political machine like Tammany Hall. And I should also mention that when I refer to Tammany Hall, I'm referring to the Democratic Party of Manhattan, New York County. Tammany Hall was where they met, right? Some people I've taught, when I refer to Tammany Hall, think I'm referring to a person, but it's the name we give to the Democratic machine in New York City. Chicago had a machine, but it was later in developing. Boston had a series of Irish American politicians who were more cult of personality, I think, than machines. But I think that New York was the epicenter of Irish American politics for most of the period from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. And it was just a function of numbers. The Irish population of New York, at one point, the Irish-born population of New York reached 25%. So that's a considerable number, and I don't know, how that translates into voters. But again, it is partly my bias, but I think that it's hard to disagree with my statement that New York was the center of Irish American politics, because you had, in addition to a powerful Democratic Party, you also had the Catholic Church, the largest Catholic archdiocese in the States at the time, and you had the nascent labor union movement, much of which was based in New York as well. So you've now got the three pillars of Irish American life coming together in New York.
Yeah, that's quite powerful if you think about those three, because they're not separate. They work together, they interact, I imagine. You can imagine the parishes are, throwing up very close relationships between people in the unions, the politicians, the churches themselves, educators. And of course, the patronage system means that there are certain niches of employment that you begin to populate, right?
Yes, before civil service really rears its ugly head, at least as far as Tammany was concerned, before civil service becomes a thing in the late 1880s, um, the Irish in New York, Boston, Chicago, anywhere there's a large percentage of Irish people, the Irish dominate many of the not civil service, but the public employment, particularly law enforcement and firefighting. Those are quintessential Irish American jobs. That is no longer true, thankfully, because it shouldn't be true anymore. But for a very long time, the quintessential Irish cop and the quintessential Irish firemen were part of the urban landscape in America's largest cities. My father was a firefighter. My father-in-law was a firefighter. My godfather was a firefighter, right? And they came from a line of firefighters and cops. And at least in my interpretation and in others, it makes sense that the Irish responded to patronage because think of what they left behind. Everything had failed them. The system had failed them. The land had failed them. And now their friends in government were offering jobs that provided a sense of stability, provided a pension, assuming you lived long enough to collect one, right? Provided the security that you didn't have in Ireland. So the Irish movement into public employment, when you consider where they came from, I think it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and politics is spearheading a lot of this quite clearly. Within the 19th century, it seems to be principally that political power seems to be in the big urban centers. But as we get into the later 19th century, I think, and into the 20th, you begin to see it regionalize and nationalize. Is that right? That you begin to see Irish political power is moving out of the cities. It's moving into governorships. It's moving into Senate. It's getting into Congress. And, eventually we'll have an Irish Catholic pitch at the presidency in the 1920s. Can you tell us more just about this period then moving into the 20th century and how political culture is changing, Terry?
Well, what you're getting is a generation now of, for the most part, American educated children and grandchildren of immigrants. Mm-hmm. You're seeing this natural progression that we Americans associate with our self-image and what makes America great. You go from the immigrant to the child who does everything for their family, to the child of immigrants who maybe goes to high school, and then the grandson, the granddaughter goes to Boston College or Georgetown or one of the Fordham and becomes a state senator and then maybe a congressman. So it is a natural progression as the Irish become less parochial, less focused on local politics, of which they were a master, mind you, and become more involved in the great issues of the day and begin using their power of the vote, not just in mayoral elections in New York City, but for example, at least in my interpretation, we start seeing Irish American voting bloc in the 1880s, where many Irish Americans voted against Grover Cleveland, although he was a Democrat, because he was thought to be anti-Irish. So I would say that nationalization process begins in the 1880s with the elections of Grover Cleveland and several other presidents moving forward. And I think it's because the Irish become more educated, less parochial, and more understanding that they can do bigger and better things than just sort of be a ward healer on the Lower East Side of New York or the North End of Boston.
Just interested to follow up on this, Terry, because you mentioned earlier as New York being the center of, as it were, the Irish political machine, whereas Boston is more personality based. Does that continue into this period into the 20th century? And if so, why doesn't Boston, I know it's smaller in terms of the base of Irishers there, but why doesn't it replicate that machine approach to local politics?
I think it's because the mayors, Honey Fitzgerald, and then especially James Michael Curley, who dominates Boston politics from the 1920s all the way until his death in the early 50s. I think they were not interested in a machine that didn't involve them. They were very much cult of personality politicians, I hesitate to speculate about Boston. It's a wonderful city and it has a great history, but for whatever reason, the machine that we saw develop, even in Chicago, just didn't develop in Boston. And I think it's simply because the Irish mayors of Boston were more self-centered, and I don't necessarily even mean that in a pejorative way, that they were less interested in the machine. And I think the smaller numbers do have something to do with it too. But to be honest, I can't give you a precise answer. Now, if I that's the academic side of me. Of course, if I were put on the journalist side of me, I would speculate endlessly about things I don't know.
I mean, if I could extend a bit further without doing too much speculation, but if we're going to look at some of the other centers of Irish population, say a Chicago or Philadelphia, do they go more the New York route towards politics, or do they go more the Boston route with individuals that continue to dominate?
Chicago and Philadelphia both develop machines. The Chicago machine, in fact, some people would argue the Chicago machine was alive and well, as recently as the last Daley to be mayor. And he left, maybe 16 years ago or so. But Philadelphia's politics are a little bit different in terms of partisanship, because there is a large Republican presence in Philadelphia, but there's a machine in Philadelphia as well. It's just that none of these machines take on the size and importance of Tammany Hall, right? Because, I mean, in any textbook that I use in my American history classes, there is only one machine ever mentioned, and it's Tammany Hall.
Going back to Tammany Hall in New York, just before we leave the 19th century and move more national, the urban machine, as you say, very much based on the population of the Irish in the city. But by the end of the 19th century, immigrant populations are growing fast and into the early 20th. And how do the Irish manage that? Do they have to cut deals? Who can they represent? Who can they not represent? I mean, it must get messy by that period. And how do they keep it all together?
It's an excellent question. I think one of the unsung heroes here is the boss of Tammany Hall from 1902 until the time he died in 1924, a guy named Charles Francis Murphy. And if I could just go on a slight tangent, speaking of those textbooks that I use in my American history classes, they all talk about Boss Tweed as a sort of quintessential evil urban Tammany boss. Well, he was all of those things, and maybe not evil, but he certainly was corrupt. But he was the boss of Tammany Hall during the American Civil War and for a few years afterwards. Charles Francis Murphy, the son of a famine immigrant, was the boss for more than basically a quarter of a century. And it was under his tenure that the Irish realized that, you know what, Jews are moving into the Lower East Side, Italians are moving in, we have to expand our reach. And it was under Murphy that we see the first Jews elected to the state legislature in New York, the Board of Aldermen in New York, under Tammany tutelage. So the Irish machine expands to include Jews, not so much the Italians. And, I know Italian Americans today who will say to me after I give my various apologies for Tammany Hall, they will say, they weren't very good to my people. And that's true. And there's a reason for that. Italian immigration, beginning in around the 1880s into the 1920s, they were true migrants. Many of the Italians came to New York, worked for 6 months, moved back to Italy. What does that mean? They didn't become citizens, therefore they didn't vote. The Jews came in families, they registered, the Jews understand the power of the vote, and Tammany responds to them. So that by the 1920s, the New York Times is reporting that New York's Jews have become Tammany's chosen people, right? And we're seeing a large number of Jews elected to office. And, it's not just that. There was a guy by the name of Louis Eisenstein, who was a Tammany leader during this time period. And he said, When my parents came to New York, unable to speak English, with no clue. They escaped the pogroms in Eastern Europe. They come to New York. The reformers looked down upon them because of their religion, because of their various habits. The one place where they could find a friend was at the local Tammany clubhouse, where they made sure that they could figure out how to get a peddler's license, that's a big deal, right? They set them up with various unofficial social services. And therefore, Tammany wins the support of New York's Jews by, as you suggested, by working with them to get them elected to office, and also by providing the social services that government didn't supply. But again, the tension with Italians was very real, and part of that was because Tammany, those people were very practical. Basically, if you're not going to register to vote, we're not really going to be able to help you. Does that mean that they weren't, that they weren't humane? Well, maybe, but they were a political organization that was formed to win elections. So, there was that practical side of things.
So into the 1920s, we have to say, or you have to tell us a bit about Al Smith. I mean, this is somebody you've written about in some detail. I don't know how well he's remembered today, but a very powerful, very significant figure. And of course, a famous tilt at the presidency.
Yes. Al Smith was born in the 1870s. His grandparents were Irish immigrants. He was also half Italian, but interestingly, he never identified as such. And with a name like Smith, right, he could have been almost anything. His father was Italian, but his mother was Irish American, and that is how he identified himself. His story is really the story, I think, of Irish America from the late 19th into the early 20th century, the story of Irish American success. His father dies basically of exhaustion. He worked so hard and his health failed. His father died when he was 13 years old. Al Smith dropped out of grade school 2 weeks before he was supposed to graduate from 8th grade. He gets a series of jobs trying to keep the family together because the fear was that the city would come in and break up the family if the widow couldn't provide for little Al and his younger sister. He eventually comes to the attention of the local Tammany crowd because he's frankly hanging out in pubs. He's got a good singing voice. He's got a stage presence. And the Tammany boyos basically say, you know what? That kid could be somebody. He's elected to the state assembly in 1904 with absolutely no qualifications. He goes up to Albany and realizes he is not educated in the least. He's utterly intimidated by these college graduates who are writing legislation. And so he decides either he's going to stop and go back to working at the Fulton Fish Market, which was a big place in New York, or he was going to learn how to be a politician. And famously, over the next few years, he became the leading expert in how New York state government worked because he read all of the legislation that came before him. They don't do that now. And he may have been the only legislator in New York history who actually did that. And so he gained a reputation. In 1911, New York suffered the worst catastrophe, worst fire short of the World Trade Center on 9/11, the worst fire in its history. A factory building called the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire burned. 144, mostly women, mostly Italian and Jewish immigrants died, and the state decided it had to do something. And the state legislature appointed Al Smith and his friend, Robert Wagner, a German immigrant, to study it. And that becomes a huge milestone in New York history, in American history, and Irish American history, because through the leadership of Al Smith and his friend, Robert Wagner, New York begins to introduce a flood of social welfare legislation. I mean, originally they were supposed to basically look and see, okay, do factories have enough sprinklers? Are there enough fire escapes? But they expanded their mission to include things like pensions for widows and children. Why would Al Smith support that? Obviously, right? The beginnings of a minimum wage, workers' compensation, eventually unemployment compensation, all of the elements that we in America have as part of our social welfare network, at least in New York, begins with Al Smith at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Through that, he's elected governor in 1918, and by 1928, he becomes the first Catholic ever nominated by a major political party for president of the United States. He suffered a terrible defeat, as any Democrat would have in 1928, but he is a very important figure, not just for all of the social legislation. I would argue that there is a straight line to be drawn between Al Smith to John Kennedy to Barack Obama, because they broke the precedent of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant supremacy in American politics. Do you get Barack Obama without Al Smith? Probably, but still, Barack Obama and Al Smith would have had a lot in common.
You mentioned that no Democrat was going to win that election, and that's true, of course, but it's also true that no Catholic was going to win that election. Wasn't that a problem?
That's also true.
Do you get a line from Al Smith to Franklin Roosevelt in terms of a more immediate effect in terms of what we call the New Deal?
Yes. Well, again, I wrote a book about the relationship between the two of them because there was such a study in contrast. Roosevelt, of course, was a patrician, went to Harvard, went to Columbia Law School. He was the fifth cousin of President Teddy Roosevelt, and was a quintessential nose in the air reformer. And while Al Smith was doing things like trying to get unemployment compensation and workers' comp, Roosevelt was nowhere to be found when they were in the state legislature together. But once Roosevelt comes down with polio, at least we think it was polio, so there's some uncertainty, but he's unable to use his legs. While Smith is governor, he appoints Roosevelt to a series of positions. Most people thought Roosevelt was finished in politics. Smith asks Roosevelt to be his campaign manager because he tried to run for president in 1924 and failed. And then in 1928, he's nominated. Franklin Roosevelt was his campaign manager. Franklin Roosevelt gave his nominating speech at both conventions. And when Al Smith runs for president in 1928, he now has to find a successor as governor. He asks Franklin Roosevelt if he would run for governor. Again, this is a man who uses a wheelchair, right? But Al Smith, to his credit, saw beyond that and said, this is the person who will continue my legacy of reform. And Roosevelt is elected governor despite Smith's defeat at the top of the ticket. And so that's a nice story, right? Al Smith, Franklin Roosevelt, isn't that nice, right? But unfortunately, or actually it worked out well for me in terms of storytelling, they become rivals. Smith is very jealous of Roosevelt's success and challenges him in 1932 for the Democratic nomination when everybody knew a Democrat was going to win that election because it was the Great Depression. And Herbert Hoover, would be lucky if he got his wife's vote. So, but Roosevelt, of course, prevailed, and then Smith turned against him. And at one point, Franklin Roosevelt says, I don't understand why Al Smith hates me. Everything I'm doing in the New Deal, Al Smith did in New York in the 1920s. And to me, I'm no psychologist, but to me, the obvious explanation is that Smith was jealous of Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's wife, once said that Smith had reverse snobbery. He felt that, Al Smith, had worked hard to get where he was. Roosevelt was known as a lightweight and got to be president because of his last name. So, and you know what? There is some merit in that from Smith's point of view. From sheer hard work, Al Smith deserved it. But Roosevelt was by far, Smith was never going to be the president that Franklin Roosevelt was.
So we're getting toward the mid-20th century, the obviously the Depression, New Deal, a huge area of political and economic significance. Apart from Al Smith, were there Irish fingerprints on that New Deal?
Well, sure. A large number of Irish Catholics were brought into Roosevelt's administration. A guy named Tommy Corcoran, or Tommy the Cork, as they called him. But significantly, a child of Irish immigrants, a guy named Ed Flynn, was the boss of the Bronx, and he was Roosevelt's chief political advisor throughout the 4 terms that Roosevelt served, although he died in the 4th term. There were several, the Irish-American bosses in Chicago and Boston and Kansas City supported Roosevelt, supported the New Deal. And while he wasn't Irish, Robert Wagner, a German immigrant who was a product of Irish Tammany Hall, is the great legislator of the New Deal. He wrote the bill that became the Social Security bill. He wrote legislation that improved access to labor unions. And again, while he wasn't Irish, he was the product of Irish machine politics. So there are Irish Americans, James Farley. How could I have forgotten? James Farley, an Irish-American, served as Roosevelt's campaign manager in 1932 and 1936 and was chairman of the Democratic National Committee for the first 2 terms of Roosevelt's presidency. Toni Morrison, the great African-American novelist, and this is before Obama was elected, Toni Morrison had once said that Bill Clinton was the first Black president because Clinton understood the Black culture and could communicate well with Black constituents. By that definition, I would almost argue that Franklin Roosevelt was the first Irish Catholic president in the sense that he had tremendous support from Irish Catholics, and he made Irish Catholics a conspicuous part of his administration.
Okay, Terry, as ever, we don't have enough time in any one subject here. We're keeping you moving forward. Thanks for keeping pace with us. If we do move into the post-war period, one of the first observations, I suppose, is that whilst the Irish now are becoming, very fully part of the American mainstream, that political machine is beginning to sort of wind down somewhat, isn't it? What happens after that war period? Moving into the 1950s, the Irish seem very fully established in so many ways. So why would machine politics begin to come apart at that point?
Do we have enough time? No, there are several reasons, which I'll describe briefly. One is the Irish begin moving out of cities, right? And while the machines certainly became a national force, they really were centered in urban America, right? Tammany Hall was based in New York City, and more specifically in Manhattan. So, and the Chicago machine, again, I don't know as much about Chicago as I probably should, but there's no question that with the end of the war, the GIs, the soldiers, are being given an opportunity to move to the suburbs, and they're doing so. So the Irish population of all of those cities is beginning to decline. And now there's a power vacuum too, which is not necessarily filled by their successors. Also, because of the New Deal, you no longer have to go to the clubhouse to get help because you're now entitled to help. You're entitled to workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, Social Security. So those are the things you went to the clubhouse for. Now you just filled out a piece of paper and you got it. So that sort of, reduces the power of the machines. Patronage begins to dry up as well, right? More and more jobs are civil service jobs so that you can't put a word in with your local district leader to get a job in the police force. It's not going to happen. So those things happen. And then at least more broadly in American politics, you are getting the loss of power of the parties in general, so that you see people declaring themselves for candidacies, not unlike John Kennedy himself when he ran for president in 1960, or even when he tried to become vice president in 1956. He didn't go to the party elders and say, would it be okay? He just did it. And we see that influence in American politics today. So the parties themselves were beginning to lose their clout, and the Irish were beginning to lose their clout in the cities because they weren't there anymore.
So the irony of this loss of power is the great success of John F. Kennedy.
Yep.
I mean, it is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? I mean, you're probably aware of the famous novel written in the mid-50s by Edwin O'Connor, The Last Hurrah, which kind of sums up that loss of power. And yet out of that same moment, in a way, comes this great ethnic triumph for the Irish. So how do you read that moment looking back? How important, how symbolic, how significant is it if we're thinking about Irish American politics?
Well, all of the stereotypes I think are true. It was the culmination of a journey that began, more than 100 years earlier. It was the culmination of the dreams of people like Al Smith and others, to attain the highest office in the land and to become leader of the free world. Of course, it is interesting that the first Irish Catholic president is not somebody like Al Smith, but it's somebody like John Kennedy. The great Irish American journalist Peggy Noonan once said, isn't it ironic that the first Irish Catholic president was really a Protestant from Harvard? But that's not a coincidence, right? Al Smith was probably really not suitable for the office, but John Kennedy had that. He had the charisma, of course, but he also wasn't threatening in a way that Al Smith might have been with his Lower East Side accent. Kennedy was polished. He had all of the finishing school aspects that we would associate with sort of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. But yet he was Catholic, and fairly conspicuously so. And he embraced his Irishness in ways that, in retrospect, are both charming but also brave. Because he was embracing this idea that you could have a hyphen in your name. Before World War II, I mean, people like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, this is going back a ways, said there's no such thing as a hyphen in American identity. You're either Irish or American. And if you're Irish, why are you here? Kennedy clearly is the first president of the United States, not just the first Catholic president of the United States, but the first president to embrace a hyphen.
Thinking about the hyphen is also, as you're suggesting, a way of thinking about embracing your immigrant background. And in 1957, I think it was, 58, President Kennedy authored a short book called A Nation of Immigrants. Actually, it was mostly ghostwritten. You're not supposed to say
Right.
that, but his name was on the cover. And it seemed to me that Kennedy was part of an element of cultural and political thinking of the time, which was beginning to think about how important it was to embrace ethnicity as a good thing and to see the nation of immigrants as really the way to think about America. Do you think he really played a strong role in that?
I do. I think he really did believe that. Frankly, nothing in his administration, which of course was only 1,000 days long, it wasn't very long at all. But if you think of immigration policy, once he becomes president, there really isn't much of one. But the fact that he embraced his own ethnicity and as you said, put his name to a book that celebrated immigration, that celebrated ethnicity, tells you a lot. That's not a book that would have been written by Dwight Eisenhower, or some of the other establishment politicians. So in some ways, he made it acceptable to be ethnic, to be an ethnic American, to go back to the homeland, as he did so famously in 1963, just before he was assassinated, and in front of television cameras, telling the American audience, this is a part of who I am. No American president had ever done that before. So it was it was a milestone in that regard too, and now that you phrase it that way, I hadn't thought of it so much, but you're right. He made ethnicity safe, and again, it's part of it is because of who he was. Again, Smith could not have done it because he was so obviously. Not only was he obviously ethnic, but Al Smith was obviously New York. Kennedy had a little bit of the Boston accent, as we know, but he did make it safe in part because of his own polish. So, but in terms of people who study ethnicity in the United States, I think you're absolutely right. You have to take into consideration what Kennedy did for ethnicity even before he was president when he wrote that book while he was senator.
So we're at one of those tumultuous periods again of social and political change into the 1960s. One of the many elements of that is that we begin, I think, to see a shift in Irish American politics, but also in how Irish Americans are thinking about their own American identity and their politics. We begin by the end of the 60s, I think, and early 70s, to see more Irish Americans moving toward the Republican Party. Would that be true?
Absolutely. I think it even before that. And I will tell you, just as a quick anecdote from my own family, my two parents. So my mother was the daughter of immigrants. My father's family had been here forever. My in-laws were the children of immigrants. Actually, my father-in-law was an immigrant from Cove. So you've got 4 Irish Americans, all four Irish Catholics. All 4 voted against Kennedy in 1960. You know, I don't tell that story to too many people, but because they felt, in the words of my mother-in-law, who is still with us at the age of 98, he was too big for his britches. So, and they were, all 4 of them, mind you, were Republicans by 1960. So we sort of saw that happening, but you're right, it really sort of becomes a thing in the 1970s. To the point where when Ronald Reagan, and an Irish Protestant, is elected in 1980, we see the Irish move to the Republican Party in large numbers and become what are called Reagan Democrats. And I think a lot of that's a complicated story. Some of it has to do with cultural politics and a backlash against liberal elites of the 1960s. A lot of it has to do with something simple like home ownership, which in the United States is associated with becoming a little bit more conservative because now you've got a stake in society. So there's that. The general suburbanization of the Irish leads to their drift into the Republican Party. But I also think a lot of it is cultural too. And you know, the end result of that is the presidency of Donald J. Trump.
When you say cultural, can we also not suggest, but I think I have to state it's also racial, isn't it? That the cultural backlash is partly a backlash against the civil rights movement.
Absolutely. There's no question about that. So issues like forced busing in Boston, right? There's a famous American photograph of demonstrations in South Boston in the late 1960s, I guess it was probably the early 70s, where these Irish Americans are protesting the busing of Black students into South Boston. And the famous photograph, which won a Pulitzer Prize, was of probably sort of a white guy, but probably Irish American, taking the U.S., a flagpole with the U.S. flag and using it as a weapon against the police who were trying to integrate the schools there. So that is absolutely correct. But because that is so ingrained in us that a lot of Irish Americans turned against the Democratic Party on racial issues, I think it's, of course, also important to remember that not every Irish American turned against the Democratic Party for racial issues.
Absolutely not. I'm not suggesting that. But there was a sea change.
Yeah.
I think an important cultural and political sea change. Scott, I know you're trying to come in there.
Well, I'm just also wondering about, as it were, Liam's, question points, I think, to that dynamic. And you talked about the shift from Democratic to Republican. But is it the case that we're also seeing a fragmentation of the Irish American constituency within the Democratic Party? I'm thinking about the Chicago machine and the events of '68, which was so famously dramatized in terms of, at the time of the Democratic National Convention, or thinking about someone like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that figure that you might consider to be from the traditional Irish American constituency in the Democratic Party, moving all the way to becoming a key advisor to Richard Nixon by the 1970s.
Right. Yes. I mean, there were conservative Democrats in the Irish community. Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, would be a prime example of that. Conservative may not even do the phrase justice. To more liberals, like, for example, Senator Eugene McCarthy, who ran for president in 1968. And it is often said, I think it was first said by the great Washington Post columnist Mary McGrory, speaking to this issue. She once said, "Why do the Irish in America have to apologize for Joe McCarthy of McCarthyism fame, but we get no credit for Eugene McCarthy?" and within certain circles in academic life in the United States, and I can speak from experience, there is the stereotype of Irish Americans as Joe McCarthy, as in today's terms, Steve Bannon. And I think that is almost a libel on Irish America, because to your point, Irish America has become divided. It was united, except for my in-laws and my parents, it was united in 1960, right? But it began to grow apart, either for partisan reasons, for racial reasons, for ideological reasons, right? Pat Moynihan made that transition, although he never left the Democratic Party, but he was anti-communist. And he felt that the Democratic Party had become soft on communism and the Soviet Union, which is part of the reasons why he worked for Nixon. So perhaps not surprisingly, in a community as large as Irish America, there are many divisions along many lines.
But I sense, just to follow up on that, and this may be a stereotype, and I'm happy for you to correct me wrong, having lived in Boston for a bit, that there's the stereotype is where Boston holds it together in a sense. Despite the friction, the ruptures of 1970s with the busing issue, that you still have that Irish American constituency that controls the mayor's office or leads to it. Indeed, through the 70s and through the 80s, and sometimes through negotiations with other communities, such as the Italian American community in Boston. Is that the case that Boston is the exception to the rule here?
I would think so, although I don't think it is any longer, right? I mean, there's right. But you're right. Through that period, even through Mayor Mamino's 20-year reign, the Irish certainly had that political power. I think some of that, is the result of the power of South Boston. There was no community in New York, or probably even Chicago, that was like South Boston for so long. Such a conspicuously Irish American community, sort of a holdover from the old days. Sort of that really sort of was a last hurrah moment for Boston. It wasn't in the book in the 1950s. It was in South Boston in the 1970s and 80s. So I do think Boston is an exception, but part of that was because of the solidarity of South Boston, which, you could go to South Boston and still see remnants of that. Whereas if you asked me to go to see where are the remnants of Irish America in New York, I would be hard pressed for you to even Woodside in Queens and Woodlawn up in the Bronx. And that's about it. So nothing comparable to South Boston, I would say.
I mean, it's interesting, that question of remnants that you mention, because I'm just wondering, as we get in now to come up toward the present, what kind of, remnants, legacies indeed, are there of Irish American political culture today? You mentioned New York. It seemed to me, it was often said that when Joe Crowley lost his seat there, it was the last of the bosses, and that was in itself maybe a watershed moment. And in fact, perhaps he lasted longer than most. On the other hand, I have interviewed some, politicians of Irish descent in the US over recent years. And what a number of them have pointed out is that although the Irish politicians are not there in the same number, they have left some fingerprints around how politics is done. The machine itself isn't dead. You can find elements functioning, for example, in Chicago, but it's not the Irish who are leading it. It's just that they helped create it.
Right. Well, for example, when African Americans in New York began to exert power, and again, based on numbers, right? So from the 1930s until the 1960s, we saw a great migration of African Americans to New York. Well, when the time came for African Americans to organize politically, they chose the machine model. There was literally a Harlem machine, which produced a mayor, David Dinkins, which produced a leading state legislator named Basil Patterson, and several others. So it was led by a guy named Leroy Jones. He understood that a machine is not a dirty word. A machine is a way of organizing and activating a community around a set of cultural or political or economic grievances or solidarities. So yes, listen, I live in New Jersey. The machine is alive and well in New Jersey. It's just not led by the Irish, right? There's a Republican machine in Monmouth County. There's a Democratic machine in Hudson County. And they're taking the model. But again, machine is, in my way of thinking it, it's not a dirty word. It means a really efficient political organization that can get out the vote. However, when the machine finds ways of stamping out dissent or rewriting rules to make insurgencies impossible, yes, of course, that's when machines deserve their sort of dirty reputation. The Irish didn't invent that sort of politics. They certainly used that sort of politics, and it continues today. But I would like to believe that the Irish contribution to American politics isn't just about machines, for better or for worse, but I also think it's a vibe as well. At least in my telling, the Irish came to the United States as the first large number of non-Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And they never lost their Irishness. There was a book written some years ago by a scholar in Harvard called How the Irish Became White. And my good friend and novelist Peter Quinn once said, the issue is not how the Irish became white. It's how the Irish remained Irish, how they continued despite prejudice and despite pressures to conform, how they embraced their ethnicity and, in the case of the Catholics, their religion in the face of hostility. But they also brought with them on those famine ships and later ships, they brought with them, I think, a suspicion of Anglo-American rugged individualism, a suspicion of laissez-faire economics, because they saw what laissez-faire economics did in Ireland. So, people like Bishop Hughes, whom I mentioned before, and other politicians who are relatively, or who are often dismissed as conservative because they're machine politicians. Well, Tammany was aligned with the Anti-Monopoly League of the 1880s. One of the founders of it was Teddy Roosevelt. So there is I think there's a skepticism for dogmatic free market economics that I think is a legacy of Irish American politicians. And I'll add one other thing. The great scholar of Judaism in New York, Hasia Diner, has written several books examining the Irish and experience with Jews. And she has said, Irish politicians created a space for Jews, for Italians, for all other groups that were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because they were there first. And, my own research of Tammany confirms that. That's not to say that Tammany was, or any other Irish machine, was willing to just turn over power to the next group. No, not that. But there was an inclusion. Was it based merely on survival? Maybe. But in Hasia Diner's telling, it was also based on a commonality that, you know what, we are outsiders. This is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. We're not that. And so we need to work together. Again, I'm not saying there wasn't Irish Catholic anti-Semitism. Of course there was, and it was terrible, and it continues. But in the lives of a lot of practical politicians, there were alliances made that I think some people would find surprising.
I think it's a great summary of the significance of the importance of Ireland and the Irish to American political culture. And I'm really tempted to end it there, but I can't end it there because we have not mentioned the name Joe Biden. And something has to be said at this point in time. There's a general silence around Mr. Biden, President Biden these days. What is his role as an Irish politician and president? You said before there'd only been one successful Catholic Irish bid at the presidency. Well, there, of course, we have two with Mr. Biden. So what are we going to be saying about him in the years to come, do you think, in terms of Irish politics and Irish America?
Right. And of course, when I was referring to Kennedy, I should have said the first, because Biden, of course, was the second. You know, it's as we historians know, it's hard to know what to make of a presidency that's been over for only 2 years. I do think that Biden, in many ways, was a quintessential, almost stereotypical Irish American politician, the backslapping, the hail fellow well met. I think in public policy, his emphasis on public works, on public investment is part of an Irish American legacy. I think his embrace of his Irishness is, a throwback to Kennedy in some ways. I think as an Irish American Paul, I think he was effective. Whether his presidency itself is regarded as effective 20, 30 years from now, who knows? But now I'm giving away my own politics, but, I feel that he stood up for a functioning democracy at a time when it was under threat. But I think it's probable that history will remember him in part because, like so many other politicians, he didn't know when to quit. But strictly in the tradition of Irish American politicians, he fits the mold, and I mean that in a very positive way.
All right. Listen, Terry, thank you very much indeed. You've taken us across a very long period of time. You've given us a very rich understanding of the importance of the Irish in the making of America, and in political terms. And that's exactly what we want to focus on in this podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you, Terry. That's all for this episode of Ireland and the Making of America.
Thanks to Terry Golway for joining and sharing his insights on the Irish political experience in the making of America.
You can follow this series on all your favorite podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, YouTube. You can follow the Clinton Institute on social media, such as Instagram, and indeed you could follow Liam Kennedy there, or follow Scott Lucas Worldview on both Instagram and YouTube.
And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, share, leave a review.
We'll be back next week with another conversation on Ireland and the making of America.
Until next time, this podcast was brought to you by the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, and produced with thanks by Michelle May.